All right, thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Colleen. I work at SUSE, and I've been working on Keystone for a couple of years now. This talk is going to be about a new feature we just added in Keystone, this last release. It's going to help make application development and deployment a little bit easier, hopefully. It's going to be a kind of a short talk because it's a pretty simple feature, but I'll go through a little bit of the history of why we decided to create something like this. I'll talk a little bit about what this thing is we created, how you can use it, and I'll give a little bit of a demo. And then I'll go into what the Keystone team and the rest of the community plans to do with application credentials this cycle and in the future. So before we had application credentials, automated authentication was a little bit awkward. So this example is a very stripped down version of what an application might have to do to authenticate with Keystone. And so in this example, I, the application developer, I have to give it my username and password directly. And maybe in this example, my user is backed by an LDAP server. So I'm using this LDAP specific domain, which means I could be using this username and password for other things in my organization, which is not great. And so in this example, this app is doing Cinder volume backups, but it could be any other cloud application doing auto-scaling, monitoring, logging, whatever else you'd like to do with your clouds. And so what would something like that mean for applications? Well, it means they're granted access to everything that my user has access to. So even if the application is only meant for doing things like backups, it's capable of booting servers or using up all your floating IPs or destroying other instances in this project, whatever else my user is allowed to do, which obviously makes it a good vector to attack and violates this principle of least privilege. And another issue we have with this is that it means these user passwords have to be stored somewhere, maybe not directly in the code like my example had it, but somewhere unencrypted, unhashed in some config file. And that's kind of an uncomfortable fact when you're just considering Keystone users in a Keystone SQL database, but it's also very common to integrate your Keystone with an LDAP backend or some other single sign-on service like a SAML provider or something like that. And in that case, it's not just your OpenStack credentials that are lying somewhere unhashed in a config file, it's the credentials for what could be your whole organization sitting unencrypted in this config file. There is an initiative for Oslo config to make it possible to store and access secrets like passwords in a safer way than just sticking them in plain text files. That would only apply to OpenStack services using Oslo config, not to your external application using whatever configuration loader it's using. This is also not completed work yet. So if you know a little bit about Keystone v3, you might ask why you couldn't have a setup sort of like this, where if we have an LDAP user backed by an LDAP-specific domain or namespace within this domain, why don't we grant them admin rights on some application-specific domain and then let them create application-specific Keystone users and then use those usernames and passwords for the applications instead of using their LDAP passwords in their applications. The problem with this is a pretty famous, thanks Adam. It's a pretty famous bug in Keystone, which makes it kind of painful and difficult to have this kind of setup without accidentally giving your users God mode powers on your whole cloud.
All services, not just Keystone,
yeah.
all services.
Yeah, it's painful. So we wanted something that was a little bit easier to deal with. And additionally, this wouldn't solve a different problem, which is that your passwords have to be changed from time to time, either because you know this password was compromised or just general good security hygiene, you want to rotate your passwords. But if your application services are using the password, then there's going to be downtime because it'll work something like this. You will have to change the password for the Keystone user, and then all of a sudden your applications stop working. And while you're rolling out the new config and restarting the services, you have that, what could be a few seconds or a few minutes of downtime where your applications can't authenticate. And if it's a small application and you have good automation, it might not matter that much, but it's still definitely not ideal. So this is what we did to try to fix these issues. We added a new authentication type in Keystone. We called it application credentials. And what it is a new authentication mechanism that grants the holder access to a single Keystone project. It uses its own secret. It's kind of like having its own password, and it can have all or a subset of the roles that a user who has created it has on this project that it's created for, which means that if a cloud administrator has defined a wide variety of roles and the cloud or the user has enough of these roles, you could delegate some of them to your application credential, and that way we can get closer to maintaining that principle of least privilege and only giving the application the access that it needs to actually do its job. The application credential is owned by the user who created it, and unlike passwords, the user can create as many as they want. A quick note on the name we gave it. We were going to call it API keys. It turned out that the meaning that we kind of associate in the computing industry with this vague term API keys was not exactly what we had in mind for what became application credentials. We didn't want this new type of like a long-lived token. We wanted more a way of exchanging data in return for a token. So we ended up calling this application credentials, just as sort of a generic way to describe what we mean, but you can also kind of think of it as just an API key. So trusts were another thing that we have in Keystone we've had it for a long time. They were created for pretty similar purposes. You want to delegate a subset of what you can do to some other entity, and for trusts, that was delegating it to a Keystone user. That also wasn't ideal for our purposes because it's not self-service. You would need to have admin access of some kind in order to create that second user to delegate to. You can create trusts where you can delegate to yourself, but then, of course, you still need your own username and password in order to authenticate, and then you're kind of back to square one. So I will, hopefully, if this works, demonstrate a little bit how you could create an application credential.
Should be able to do stuff like this. We didn't really forward plan that stuff or whatever when we built it in, and we needed a new abstraction to really limit the damage that could be done here.
So let me try to repeat that for the recording. So the question is it correct to say that the big benefit we're getting is that this isn't a user? And I think, yes, we're not treating this as a user anymore. We're treating this as something that we can give to an application and stop thinking about this in terms of human users. So this feature landed or application credentials landed in Keystone and Queens. Support in the clients lands, well, it's being developed in Rocky. So this is master of Horizon. And so this is also a very stripped down OpenStack. I only have Keystone and Horizon set up here. Can you see that? So under the Identity tab, there's a new menu item, Application Credentials. And we can just create a new one. I can give it a name and a description. I can give it a secret if I want to, if your company or your organization has specific rules for password policies or that type of thing. If you don't provide a secret, though, Keystone will generate a random string for you. I can give it an expiration if I want to. Probably sometime in the future would be good. And then I can delegate a subset of the roles I have on this project that I'm scoped to. So in this DevStack instance, I have 2 roles on this project. We could imagine that maybe one role has more permissions than the other or a different set of permissions. And I could say, I only want this application credential to have one type of permission on this. And then we added this, this other Boolean, this restricted, unrestricted thing, because we wanted to have a very, very basic safeguard against like a runaway application credential and prevent this thing from creating additional application credentials or creating additional Keystone trusts. But we decided that for some use cases, especially heat use cases, we actually do want an application credential to be able to have that ability, so we just said, well, we'll turn it off by default and we'll let the user decide what they want to allow this, this application credential to do. In the future, we want to be able to have much more control over this, so this is just a very basic safeguard. So when we create the application credential, the secret string is exposed to us once. This isn't stored anywhere. This is hashed before it's put in the database. And I can download an OpenRC file, or I can download a clouds.yaml file. And I can move that clouds.yaml file into my, my OpenStack config. And I should be able to get a token with it. So it's pretty easy. Your application is going to work something like that. Yes, actually, I'll show. I'll show a much clearer example. Yeah, so it'll look something like this. Let me pull back my notes. Okay, so this is that closer look. And so this is what a clouds.yaml file will look like, an OpenRC file, or the Keystone auth token section of an OpenStack config file will have a pretty similar idea. The difference here between just a regular clouds.yaml is you have this auth type v3 application credential, and you have to specify the application credential ID and the secret string. The application credential ID will uniquely identify it across the deployment, same as a user ID would uniquely identify a user across a deployment. But you could write this in a little bit more human-friendly way if you like. You could identify it by name, but in that case, you also have to identify the user who owns it, either by the user ID or the username and the user domain. So rotation is something that we can do with application credentials more easily than we can do with passwords, and you'll want to do that every once in a while, and it'll look something like this. You'll create your new application credential. It's going to have its own ID. You'll have to give it a unique name, unique to your user. And at that point, your applications aren't broken. They're still running. Everything's fine because they don't even know about this new application credential. Then you'll start to roll out this new application credential in your config files and start restarting your services. And you can do this gradually. And so when that's all done, you can finally decommission the old application credential. And so with application credentials, the only downtime is when you're bouncing these services. And if you're using a load balancer, that's not so much of a problem. So one thing that's worth mentioning is a major kind of hurdle we went through with this design process that's kind of worth bringing up is what owns the application credential and what's the lifespan. So a major ask from operators and application developers was for the application credentials to be owned by a Keystone project and not at all tied to the user who created it. Because one of the big problems with just having usernames and passwords was that if the user leaves the team, they get fired, whatever, the applications that the username and password was using, or the applications that were using that username and password, they stop working when the user is deleted. And so what we wanted originally was for application credentials to be able to get away from that type of thing, to be completely decoupled from users, since the focus is on applications and not on users. And so in the forum discussions, that sort of seemed like a great idea, but as we got closer and narrowed this down in the spec, we sort of realized that this actually opened up a pretty massive hole, because users could then use this application credential, they might create it in secret or whatever, and they could continue to use it even after it was deleted. And we decided that was really just not an acceptable risk and not something we wanted to encourage. So the result now is that the application credential is still tied to the user, but we're much closer to being able to enable the application availability because we have this rotation mechanism. So you can build business processes around this. So if you know ahead of time that a member of your team is going to leave the team, you have to plan ahead of time to rotate the application credential. So create a new one with a new user, rotate it out before your application starts having downtime. And then on the other hand, if someone else on the team is leaving, even if they didn't create the application credential, even if their leaving isn't going to cause downtime, while they were on the team, they had the opportunity to read the application credential, because that's going to be stored in config files, config management, and all over the place. So it's good practice to rotate these secrets anyways. And so that's something that application credentials gives you that's better than what we had with passwords, because you are actually able to maintain that good security hygiene and actually rotate those out more easily. Keystone can't solve people problems. You have to have proper business practices in place in order to do this. But what we can do is enable you to make those secure choices and facilitate that smoother application development. So there's some things now that we have those in place, there's some things that we'd like to do with this in the future. One of the main goals we had with application credentials was helping to fix that principal least privilege problem, and we've succeeded in some ways by ensuring that the application credential can only be used for one of the user's projects, and you have if you have a wide variety of descriptive roles, and your user has enough of those roles assigned to them that they can delegate them to their application credential, you get pretty close to being able to properly limit the access an application credential has. But most deployments right now only have two roles. They have the admin role and the member role. And even if they have more than that, the user can't assign roles to themselves in order to grant them to their application credential. And more than that, they can't discover what roles they need in order to ask an administrator for those roles. So what we're working on in this cycle is a way for the user to whitelist certain API actions for the application credentials so that they have more fine-grained control over precisely what APIs the application credential is allowed to be used for. And eventually, we hope that we can make role assignments as easy as this or something like this, and that the future of application credentials will be compatible with this paradise future of RBAC and Keystone. Another thing we'd like to do is one of those big requests was for application credentials to be project-lived, and we didn't deliver on that because of those security concerns. But we still want to empower projects to get close to what they need. So we want to help them build services around automatic credential rotations so that, for example, compute instances could have something like their own identity without being tied to a particular user. And another thing we want to do is one of the big achievements we had in Queens was the introduction of the system scope for things, for actions being performed on a system level, for operations being performed on a system level, things like managing hypervisors or managing Keystone endpoints. That work was being done at the same time that application credentials were being developed. And now that we have both of them, we would like for administrators to be able to automate some of those system level operations. So we'd like to make application credentials not just for projects, but for the system as well. And that is all I had. I'd be happy to take any questions now if there are any.
So thanks for the presentation. This is great. I've been waiting for this for a while. But just can you explain a little bit, maybe I missed it, but trying to understand the difference between this and a long-lived token. So it can expire, right? I guess so that's the main difference, that it can expire, but you still have to do the rotation out manually.
You have a little bit more control over this. Tokens do expire, and this can expire if we want to. And this is something that a user has more control over. They can exchange it for a token. And this lives in a database, so it's something that's controlled by a user. They can create as many as they want. They can assign different role assignments for these application credentials, so you can't really do that with tokens.
Right, okay. So, but the rotation is still entirely manual. Like, there's no concept of auto rotation yet. You talked about it at the end there, but that's future.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, my question is how closely tied it is to the user versus the project. So I saw the long-lived project reference, but I didn't see if a user's a member in 3 projects, does the application credential get access to all 3 of those projects?
No, you can only create an application credential for one project at a time. So if you had an application that needed access to 3 different projects, you'd have to create 3 different application credentials.
Okay. And if the user loses a role, like a member in a project, does the credential also lose the role?
The credential would actually get deleted altogether. The application credentials are immutable, so if something changes about the user, either the user is deleted or they lose a role assignment in the project, then the application credential becomes useless.
Okay, thank you.
Hang on, you said there it was deleted. Would it not make more sense to show as revoked in the list of credentials so that other people could see that this previous credential is now revoked and not just gone from the list?
We did have a discussion about how useful that was. Arguably, yes. I think there was some trade-offs that we had to make. I don't recall exactly.
And then a related question to this. So I fire somebody because they've gone and done something completely crazy and I need to rotate those credentials. To what degree are the new credentials tracked and auditable? Can I specifically say, where's everything else that's actually pulling this old credential now? That I need to go and find where the hell he used it because he didn't leave good documentation.
Right. Well, we don't have a good mechanism for that yet, as far as I know.
You would only know where it's been used, right? If you're setting up auditing and using the CADF type stuff to track where people log in, you're going to see the app credentials have been used. Obviously, if they tucked it away in a file, a cloud.yaml file with a time bomb to run sometime, you're never going to know that. So, right?
And until it tries to use it.
Until it tries to use it, but at which point you should have revoked. In fact, if you had fired the person, their credential would be revoked at that point anyway. So.
Yeah, and I do want to still find out, even though, hey, why was there a failure logged still? What else has he left behind?
Yeah.
But to Adam's point,
Keystone can't solve people problems.
Yeah.
But to Adam's point, if the user has been fired, then their application credential can't be used anymore. It's gone.
Yeah, because I still want a log of that failure event.
Right.
Okay.
That's
It's still going to be there. Okay. And it's still going to show up tied to this past fired user why did something attempt to run a month after I fired him?
And I had one comment about the deleting user causing the deleted application credentials. I understand the dilemma, but in practice, users will create the application credentials for running application, not for a specific user. And so, like if Team City is connecting to Bitbucket or one of these others, we would probably end up using service accounts instead of user accounts. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that was one of the arguments that we said is like if you really need that in creative services, you leave it as
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we'll still attempt to close bug 9686.
Yeah. The comment was, if you mean, do you mean by service user just a SQL user? And yes.
I got one for you.
Okay. Use the mic, please.
That's the first and last time you'll ever hear that.
There's actually a standing rule that you don't give Adam a mic. No, as we were going through this, and I realized that the app credentials are a symmetric shared secret, and I was thinking how we could do something that's asymmetric. I realized, I think the answer is, did we discuss using app credentials in conjunction with federation so that you could like do a service user and then have that tied to the app credential? Did we discuss that at all?
That's something that's been coming up this week. Is,
Okay.
Yeah, how could we how could we have a federated user create an application credential and maybe use that application credential only local to some federated deployment?
Right. Yeah, because the two ways I could see it being useful is either with Kerberos and creating a service account or service principal, and using PKI and generating an X509. And in both those cases, it'd be easier to reuse federation than to try to build something custom in there. I was just wondering if we had discussed that yet.
Yeah, it's only started coming up this
Okay,
week,
cool.
which is exciting. All right, if you want to talk to the Keystone team about this, you can find us in our IRC channel or on the OpenStack dev mailing list. If you want to talk to me, I'm on IRC and I'm on Twitter. Thanks, everybody, for coming.